Last time we were together, we were going through a miniature case study of sorts in order to understand the complexities of student needs and how they interact with each other and how to develop programming. In this case, we're not even identifying what the specific intervention or evidence-based practice would be so much as we're really digging into thinking about how visible or documented behavior can actually be an underlying need for communication or safety or sensory issues when thinking about transitioning, and how all those things together mean we need to think about what's the underlying thing we're trying to address. And we left it off with this slide here where we were thinking about, it sounds like communication and the need to travel or transition has something to do with the self-injurious behavior and the refusals and the yelling and the behaviors that we're seeing. So we need to address those things in hopes that we will then also address the behaviors by giving some skills that would reduce the behaviors that are occurring. And in this case, you see that we have a baseline, which is the student is not correctly or effectively responding to appropriate communications or requests or prompts, and they are traveling less than 30 feet with an average of five stops, meaning when they do not leave the classroom or they're in the hallway and they're engaging in behaviors that make it so that the transition between one thing and another, or when the request happens, it's time for us to go back to our classroom, they're engaging in an average of 5 behavior stops. That means that they're missing out on opportunities to get to the next setting and engage in academic performance things and learning of skills in that next setting. So what does that mean for when we're thinking about developing programming? It's a lot of information, but it's kind of thinking, let's just say we're thinking in this breaking it down that we're saying communication strategies, communication responses, location of travel, distance traveled, number of behaviors. What we're saying is this is interrelated, so you can kind of see the attempt to draw here like a version of it becomes a web because it's all interconnected, and that's why when you kind of think about programming, you have to think beyond just what you're observing and try to understand what's underneath or the meaning of it. So the disability-related need in this miniature case study is the idea of this student needs communication strategies, and they need to be able to transition, right? We can't just keep them in one classroom, or they can't stay at home because they don't like to transition between home and school and take the traveling opportunities in between, getting on the bus or whatever it is, right? So we have a disability-related need of communication strategies and distance traveled or location of travel. The target skills related to that need might be that we are working on communication responses and the distance traveled so that the student can communicate or have appropriate communication responses and reduce the number of behaviors. That these things are related. If we think about that they have communication needs, then we need to address the communications. If they have difficulty with traveling and we can change the traveling, we'll reduce the number of behaviors. And this could go further to say, if we reduce the number of behaviors and increase the ability to communicate wants and needs and respond to communication requests, that student will be able to gain more skills and knowledge appropriately in the settings that we're asking them to be in school. So these things become very related. So what does that mean for collecting data? Right? So it's not enough just to say, yep, we're going to address these behaviors, and we've made our goal to say, I want to think about the number of times they engage in that behavior and reduce the number of unnecessary behaviors. In this case, we're saying we have to think about how we're going to monitor progress to whatever we're saying. And we said, if I back up for 1 second as that reminder, not written in our measurable IEP quality goal statement, but our collaboratively written goal is that we're working on receptive communication, or the student's ability to receive communication that might be a prompt to do something, and their ability to travel or transition by responding to cues, and then therefore increasing their distance traveled when that's requested of them. That's essentially what we're saying in order to reduce behaviors. So we're thinking in this case that we want to collect data at least least 3 times per week on some type of chart where school staff that support these routines, so in between specials or transitioning to lunch or going from the special education room into the general education room, or when they need to go to the SLP room, potentially, these are the times that we know for a fact there are, let's say, for this student, a minimum of 3 times a week, they're going to be having those kinds of transitions. And we also want to think that we know that data could be analyzed every 6 weeks because that's the end of a session that we are engaging in. And we're going to think at the trimester, we're going to also report this out to parents because of progress reports, right? So since the student's daily performance is going to be variable, we don't want 1 day a week. So we're going to be thinking probably about averages. And so we want to have multiple data points a week that could maybe showcase, as we know, that students have, let's say, Mondays and Fridays, or days when students have maybe more trouble with some things because they've been home on the weekend on Mondays, and on Fridays they're heading into the weekend. So we know that 3 times a week is probably going to give us a good snapshot of where the student really is, and that's where we're going to land on saying how we're going to collect data on this. And in this case, just an example of then a chart that is collectively thought of in terms of gathering data. Quick, potentially accurate, could be used by all staff because we want to think we need to collect data. The transitions, when we're talking about something like that, we need to be able to think that that's happening in multiple settings. So multiple professionals need to be able to collect data on this goal for us. So in this case, you're able to see the example is, let's say the response to communication is that they're a tactile cue, or there's a sign or a vocalization, or that they engage in a behavior that showcases that they heard the prompt and moves to travel, versus the strategy they use is a sign, a symbol, auditory, a cue, and the distance traveled, the behavior, and the number of behaviors. So we know, because we've already defined the behavior, it sounds like, that the behavior looks like dropping on the ground, it looks like yelling, it looks like harming themselves, and sometimes something else. So we're able to quickly tally when we saw that occurring, and we know that this student was asked to travel or transition to music, and they were asked to potentially engage in transitioning to another environment, going through the hallway in music, and the response to the prompt was that they moved to the door, so that's good, and then we're able to see they engaged in some behaviors along the way. This is just an example. This is not the real data collection thing. I just wanted you to see how you can take information, if I back my slides up all the way over here for a second, to say, we had these conversations about the student needs, and we took everything we learned about it to try to make some type of tool that allows us to capture not only what we're trying to measure and change, but then how we're going to be able to show progress. So in this case, we would be able to take a look at all of that information that we've developed and say, we think our final goal is that we want the student to improve their receptive communication, their ability to receive prompts and communication, and then travel and transition by responding to those cues, and increase how far they travel outside the classroom without engaging in the behavior, or those behaviors it being less frequent, so that they can participate in the general education or instructional activities. We know the baseline is they are not responding to communication, they are traveling less than 30 feet, and they have 5 behavior stops along the way. So if we're trying to say that we're collecting data on this 3 times a week by any school staff, and we know that then every 6 weeks and end of trimester we're going to share data with the family, now we're able to maybe write a measurable goal statement. That might be something like, because we need to say who will do what with what conditions, how well, or how frequently, that given tactile signs, visual cues, or other requests for travel and transitions between locations, and for the sake of this example, I'm just saying travel or transitions, but depending on the actual student, you would focus in on transitions versus travel. Between locations, the student will respond to a request or initiate their travel and transition 2 times per week, traveling at least 50 feet with no more than 1 behavior stop. Tells me exactly what I'm looking for. The student to acknowledge or understand that there was some type of cue or request or prompt, to do something about it and go a certain amount of distance, and hopefully eventually have fewer behaviors. What that looks like is potentially then having benchmarks for how you'll know progress is made, and we'll talk about this more in depth in one of our future modules. But in this case, when we're thinking, how do we know progress happens? Well, you're able to say, after communication using tactile cues and signs, a student was able to initiate travel. And then maybe they increased their desired travel skills and they went 25 feet with few behaviors. Well, then you know that this is working if any one of those areas is potentially changing. So when I'm able to go back to these specific things here and say, if I see 2 behaviors after 6 weeks, or if I see additional distance traveled, or I see response to the cue, but we're still working on these 2 things, I know that we are making progress and that I should continue with what this intervention is. Now, again, I'm not talking about the intervention specifically, but I am starting for us to think about the relationship between programming, writing goals, which is to say, based on the programming, what do I think the students should be able to do and how often and when will I monitor progress and how will I know if progress is occurring?